Very much. Can you guys hear me? That's awesome. Man, these lights are bright. Oh, goodness. I'm very honored to be here by way of introduction. My name is Shermann Dilla Thomas. I fancy myself a Chicago historian, born and raised on the south side of God's greatest city, Chicago, Illinois. Born to a Chicago policeman. My dad was a cop for 32 years. He was of one of Mayor Harold Washington's bodyguards. He was a bodyguard to Carol Moseley Brown when she was becoming the first African-American woman to be a U.S. senator. And so growing up like that, when you grow up with a cop as a dad, everything has a historical value, and riding around with him, that got me to appreciate the history of my city. Professionally, just stopped being an area operator, a line worker for CoF. I'm now a digital content manager for CoF, an Exelon company. And then aside from that, I run Chicago Mahogany. It is a tour company as well as a foundation where we help to change the perspective of Chicago. And I'm super happy to be here at City of the Future because Chicago is one of the first American cities to think about the future in a real sustainable way. The number one engineering feat, so says the Army Corps of Engineers, is the reversal of the Chicago River, right? That is the number one engineering feat of the 19th century. Why did they reverse the Chicago River? Because the Lake Michigan is our drinking water. It still is today. And formerly, the Chicago River flowed into Lake Michigan. Well, Chicago becomes a city in 1837. We didn't have the EPA then. We didn't even really have indoor plumbing. And so where did your excrement go? It went in the Chicago River. And then, you know, Chicago is a place that had steel mills and factories. We had the Chicago Union Stockyard. And where did all that waste go? It went into the Chicago River. And so at one point, Chicago had a cholera epidemic, and about 30% of our city died from drinking bad water. So they said, okay, we got to fix this. We got to reverse the flow of the Chicago River. And they dig a canal right next to the Chicago River. And they dig it just deeper than the Chicago River. And so that forces gravity to pull the flow of the Chicago River back. And they do that thinking about the future, thinking that in 100, 150 years, 200 years, Chicagoans are going to still need to drink the water of Lake Michigan. Right now, Lake Michigan's water is one of the most sustainable, clean, fresh water sources in this country. So says all the environmentalists. And so Chicago is thinking about its future, even in that early planning. They complete the reversal of the Chicago River right about 1900, and it's very successful. And now the Chicago River flows into the Des Plaines River, and then it flows into the Mississippi River down to St. Louis. St. Louis sued the city of Chicago. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Said, no, y'all got to reverse that river. We don't want your wastewater. Why do we got to drink Chicago wastewater? They lost that case, but Chicago had to start the St. Louis Water Reclamation District with Chicago money, right? So that's also Chicago helping St. Louis clean up their water. And then we started our own. But don't worry, St. Louis gets us back every year. They bottle up that water in St. Louis, send it back to Chicago, and they call it Budweiser. But, oh, sorry, St. Louis. There are other ways, though, that Chicago has been, since its inception, showing the world how to be a city of the future. And I can especially appreciate that working for the electric company. The world's first ever steam turbine energy generator comes from Fish Station in Chicago. Sometimes we don't like saying his name, Samuel Unsel, but Samuel Unsel was a really pioneering, future-thinking guy. And right now, not Silicon Valley, sorry, not DC, not New York, but Chicago is bringing in the most tech startups than any other city in the country. Why? Because of the infrastructure that Sam Unsel in the early 1900s laid out. When we lay down power lines under the street, we put them in duct packages. So if we're going to put one power line in, we typically put 3 duct packages. Why? So that way if one of the power lines blows up, we don't got to re-dig up the street. We can just run a new line in the adjacent duct package, and you guys can get your power back. Well, Chicago and Sam Unsel was so forward-thinking that he was dropping 12 duct packages per one line. And so what does that do today? If you need fiber optics ran into a downtown building, Well, you don't even got to dig up the streets, and that lowers your cost of permitting. And so that's what allows for new tech companies to grow out of Chicago. The first ever woman tech unicorn is from Chicago, Miss Ross. Hey, Dilla, what's the tech unicorn? I'm glad you asked, I'll tell you. That means if you start a tech company and then you sell it for $1 billion, you're considered a tech unicorn. And America's first woman unicorn comes from Chicago. That's thinking sustainable, that's thinking about the future in a real sustainable way. Chicago has probably half the amount of high rises that New York has, but we have double the amount of green rooftop spaces than New York has. In fact, today in 2023, if you're going to build a high rise in downtown Chicago, it must include a rooftop garden. Why? Thinking about the future, thinking about sustainability. We have double the amount of LEED buildings than the second highest city in the country. Why? Sustainability. It's a Chicago thing. Now, some sucky stuff comes from Chicago too, but the fix for that sucky thing comes out of Chicago as well. What's one of those sucky things, Dilla? Well, how about restrictive racial covenants that etch themselves in the neighborhoods of cities across Chicago? Hey, Dilla, what's a restrictive racial covenant? I'll tell you. So formerly, between about 1898 to 1949, it was legal in this country to say, I will not sell my house to, lease my house to, or rent my house to an African American, a Jewish American, a Latino American. And if 90% of the property owners in whatever line you drew agreed, that neighborhood now had a binding restrictive racial covenant. That concept comes out of Chicago. The Chicago Real Estate Association creates that concept. And those lines draw neighborhoods. And we name the neighborhoods after those boundaries that is created. And those boundaries and neighborhoods are still etched in our cities today. But the fix for that also comes from Chicago. I'm sort of judging you if you've never seen A Raisin in the Sun. Raisin in the Sun was written by Lorraine Hansberry. She's the first African-American woman to have a play produced on Broadway. Of course, she's from Chicago. There's a couple versions you can watch. One has Sidney Poitier, one has P. Diddy. Whichever one you want to watch one of them, right? But in that, her father, it's about the story of her father, Carl Hansberry, who buys a 3-flat apartment in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago, but it has a restrictive racial covenant. And so when they move in, one of the neighbors calls the police, gets them evicted, and then sues them to take the property from them. They win the case in the first level of the Illinois court. So then Carl Hansberry, he fights the case. He takes it to the Illinois appellate court. He loses. So then they take the case to the United States Supreme Court. And a lawyer who is my favorite Chicagoan, Earl B. Dickerson, is the lawyer. He does not contest the legality or the constitutionality of the restrictive racial covenants. What he contests is that 90% of the homeowners are not actively signed. Why? Let's say, hey, I'm a white dude. Hey, Gary, let's say you're a white dude. I sell you the house. But because we're both white, I don't make you sign anything. So that means this area does not have active signatures. And so they contested that. And so they had to go re-knock on all those doors, and it turned out that there was some cool white dudes in that neighborhood like, nah, I'm not signing nothing. I think that's stupid. So then they did not have the 90% they needed. That precedent was adhered to, and Earl B. Dickerson won the first ever restrictive racial covenant case, opening up a neighborhood for people of all ethnicities to move to. And then so city after city started to file cases based off of that precedent. And then finally in 1949, a guy by the name of Thurgood Marshall won the Shelby v. Kramer case that ended restrictive covenants forever. But the precedent comes from God's greatest city, Chicago, right? And also, as it relates to baseball, right, it was a guy by the name of Cap Anson who started the gentleman's agreement that stopped African Americans from playing baseball. He was on the north side of Chicago, and there's another guy from Chicago named Fritz Pollard. He's the NFL's first black quarterback. He's also the first black guy to play in the Rose Bowl, black guy to get a scholarship to Brown University. And anyway, they would play barnyard games, and Fritz Pollard's team beat the hell out of the Cubs one day. And Cap Anson said, we ain't playing black dudes no more. Hecky no. But it's also out of Chicago that we start to break baseball. You famously heard that Jackie Robinson broke the color line, and that's true. But the first time they saw Jackie Robinson play was in Chicago, 1933 in July at the East-West All-Star Game, right? The Negro Leagues All-Star Game. And that happened during Chicago's second World Fair, the Century of Progress World's Fair. Simultaneously, the dude that invented the point spread, right? He was a Chicago Tribune writer. And so he, tinkering around, invents the point spread. But he wants to see it in action, right? It's one thing to have theory, but you got to bet real money on a real game. And so in July, during the World's Fair in 1933, there was nothing going on. So he went to the owner of the Sox and he said, hey, I've heard a lot of major league players are in the city for the World's Fair. Let's have an exhibition game. So the owner of the Sox calls the owner of the Giants, and he calls the owners of the Cardinals, and blah, blah, blah. They have an exhibition game at Comiskey Park in 1933, and that's the world's first ever Major League Baseball game. So a guy by the name of Rube Foster sees this, and he's like, oh, man, Major League just made a whole bunch of money doing that. We should have a Negro League All-Star game. And they have one 60 days after Major League Baseball's All-Star game. But all the Major League owners hear about it, so they come back to watch that game. And that's the first time that the Major League owners see how good Satchel Paige really is. They see how good all of these Negro League luminaries are. And that's what starts them on the trend of thinking about scouting them. And then finally, Jackie Robinson breaks the color line. All of that amazing stuff starts in Chicago. Now, I know there's a couple Exelon employees in here, and I'm supposed to say rate case or something, right? We're never supposed to use the words rate increase. But regulatory practices of electricity come from Chicago. There are other places in the world where the municipality just takes over the electric company and the city runs the electric company. I'm thinking about suburbs like Naperville and other places. But Samuel Unseld in Chicago is the first electric company ever to go to the state and say, hey, electricity should be regulated. You guys should decide when and where we change the prices and what we change it for. And in exchange for that, you give companies monopolies over areas. Why is that important? Because it's safer, right? If I own the power lines from one end to the city to the other, then I know what's alpha phase and bravo phase, right? And to novices, that may not sound like a lot, but if alpha phase touch bravo phase or 12,000 volts, it's going to be a big bang, right? People are going to lose some power, and that's going to be an inconvenience to everybody. So the thought to regulate electricity for the future, right, so that it'll be sustainable and have equal access to all communities, that also comes from America's greatest city. So I started researching these things to combat what you may have heard about Chicago in the national media. A lot of times when Chicago is on the national media, it's about gang violence and street crime, and it always starts at the right now, right? You see that nasty stat, it'll say like 50 people shot over in Chicago over the weekend, and there's never anything that kind of states why we end up in these spaces, right? A lot of times marginalized people are placed in these spaces that come out of red line neighborhoods. And that's also something that Chicago was very active in doing. But the fix in that comes from Chicago as well, because Dr. Martin Luther King came to Chicago in 1966, and he lived there for the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was to change how housing was done in this country. And it was the images of Dr. King being hit in the head with a rock in Marquette Park on 67th and Kedzie that was shared around this country that led to the Equal Housing Act of 1968. So sometimes you have to take a blow to push things forward. And that's what I want to encourage companies to do. A lot of times, man, I hope there's some good bosses in here, there will be messaging that needs to get out. One of those messages, for instance, right, we had the EMA bill in Chicago, the Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act. What that did was that replaced the meters, put in smart meters, but it also removed a lot of lead cable from underground. And I had been begging ComEd to tell the other human side of that story. What's that? Well, there was about 900 temporary employees on the ground. And if they did not get the EMA bill passed, those 900 temporary employees would not have gotten full-time jobs. So EMA passed, and in exchange for that, in their rate case, they had to hire all 900 of those folks as full-time employees. Now, what does that got to do with anything? Well, I personally know about 70 of those people have bought houses in marginalized spaces because they went from a temporary job to a full-time union trade job that's, either paying six figures or knocking at it. Now they're able to become homeowners in neighborhoods that need more homeowners. And then what happens? They pay taxes on those homes. That tax money goes to schools. And then those schools are able to do better with better money and better funding. All of that came from EMA. I bought a house in a marginalized neighborhood so that kids in my neighborhood could come outside and see a dude yell at his kids and get cussed out by his wife by not bringing in the groceries fast enough. Because I understand that imaging is important. But in telling that story, you're going to get negative people in the comments. You're going to get people that want to talk about, well, my lights were out for 2 days. Do not let the loud minority stop you from telling human stories, because the human stories are going to make sure that all of us have a place to live in the city of the future. I'll stop running my mouth now. Thank you very much. We'll have a panel.